All right, so now we're going to wrap up our nested hierarchical model of social structure and processes by looking at the social processes. These are, as I've mentioned before, the interactional based processes that link the individual self to these larger social structures that we've been talking about. So let's start again by taking a quick overlook of the model. And keep in mind two things about these social processes. One, as I mentioned, they're grounded in interaction, right? So these social processes operate um, through other members of society, and we'll see that kind of playing out as we walk through each of these processes. Also, of course, that the process is facilitated by culture, right? The medium of exchange for social interaction is a symbolic medium, right? So symbols and language. So this entire process is informed not just by that, but also by the broad social values that are embedded in a culture as well. So the connection between social structure and culture kind of really shows up significantly in the nature and the character of these interactions that are part of these social processes. All right, so let's start with socialization. Socialization is a process through which people acquire cultural competency. You can see here that the arrow points from society toward the individual. That just indicates the direction of influence. So when we're born into this world, we really don't have much in the way of um, abilities or skills. We have a tremendous amount of potential. But what happens is we get exposed to other members of society, first our immediate family and our extended family, and then increasingly a larger set of social others who make up our communities and um, um, the educational settings where we spend our early years, right? And these and television and other cultural forms, all of which end up delivering information to us, which we internalize and use to help guide ourselves through society as we become increasingly autonomous and able to sort of increasingly take care of ourselves. Socialization, as I said, is a lifelong process. It starts when you're born, doesn't really ever end. I suppose when you die, your socialization certainly can stop at that point. Most of the important stuff does happen in early childhood for obvious reasons, but keep in mind that transitioning from, say, for example, high school to college is a process of socialization, right? The norms and the expectations of college students, the role of college student is different in many ways from that of a high school student. There are some similarities, but obviously it's a different sort of status. And then, of course, transitioning from being a student in college to being a member of the labor force or being a parent or being a spouse. All of these transitions are essentially the acquisition of new statuses. Those new statuses have role expectations attached to them. And of course, you have to learn those. And you learn them from people who already do them. You learn them from cultural forms. You learn them through media, right? So when we say that socialization is a lifelong process, we really do mean that it basically continues on across the entirety of one's life. Through this process, what happens is we as individuals gain what we could call cultural competence, right? The ability to navigate our way through our society in a way that's informed by its values, by the meanings that are attached to symbols and language and all of that, right? So we become competent participants in this larger society. But the thing that people often overlook is that society gets something out of this as well, which is a replication of social structure. So when we talked about the paradox through which social order arises, right? Social order arises through our shared behavior. That's how we get social structure. But then social structure informs how it is we're supposed to behave, right? So that kind of cyclical or reciprocal relationship in which there's kind of a feedback um, um, this is what we're looking at in the second half of that definition, right? Society is perpetuating the fundamental nature of its structure by teaching us how to behave in ways that create and recreate that structure. So when you're thinking about socialization, I think it's easy to remember the impact that it has on us. But it's also important to remember that the impact goes the other way, that our behavior then in the aggregate level is what's creating the structure that socialization uses to sort of teach us how to do that. Okay, so that's socialization. Social control is a little bit different. Still, the arrow is pointing in, so the direction of influence is from the larger society toward the individual. But in social control, what we have are external processes, right? Socialization is kind of an internalization of social expectations, but social control is a set of external conditions, right? That the norms and the expectations of society are reinforced and monitored by the presence of these external conditions, which include individuals, right? People we call agents of social control, but also sometimes structural features. I do a study abroad program to London every few years. I take some students in my social problems class to London for a couple of weeks, and we do like a little comparative analysis, right? Some time at Harper and then some time in London. And one of the things that my students often remark on is that as they're walking around the city, as they're getting oriented to this new place, they notice painted on the sidewalks before you enter a crosswalk in central London, you'll see painted on the sidewalk the words "look right," and for a minute it takes them a bit to sort of catch on, but you can see the confusion for just a moment. But then they realize that traffic is going to be coming from the right because people in London drive on the left-hand side of the road. People who are visiting London often forget this because they come from societies where people drive on the right-hand side of the road, which means that traffic would be coming from the left. And so we're accustomed to looking left, but that particular set of behaviors is not going to actually result in increased safety. Looking to the right will actually ensure greater safety. So rather than have somebody stand at the intersection, each and every intersection in central London, they've just painted it on the sidewalk. That's a kind of a mechanism of social control to remind people of the proper pattern of behavior in this particular place where driving may look different than it does in the places where people are coming from. So it's easy to think of agents of social control in the form of like teachers or police officers or religious leaders or other parents, for example. But it's important to remember that social control is a much broader process than just the people who enforce the norms and the expectations of society. Deviance, a little bit different. Deviance, we can see the arrow pointing out here, which indicates the direction of influence. Although, as I'll point out in a moment, this is a little bit maybe an overstatement. But generally speaking, deviance consists of behaviors, ideas, or attributes of an individual or group that violate normative standards. What that means, of course, is that it could consist of either behaviors or traits, what we would say acts or attributes. The deviation from a social norm causes a little bit of an effect on the broader society, but not very much, right? Because, for example, in the United States, you might be one of over 320 million people, right? Your individual level deviant behavior, your deviation from social expectations, isn't going to have much of an impact on those expectations. It might have an immediate effect on your family. It might have an immediate effect on your peers or your friends. But generally speaking, the scope and the impact of deviance on the larger society is going to be relatively negligible. If we're looking at a social process that's actually going to result in creating significant social change, then we need to look to collective action. So collective action consists of efforts by groups of people to achieve structural or cultural change in society. And there are two broad kinds of collective action. And we can see here again, the arrow is pointing out. And here, the impact is going to be much more significant. Now, some forms of collective action show up in what we call collective behavior. Collective behavior is largely spontaneous. It's a set of shared actions that arise in response to circumstances and the moment. And they are contrasted with social movements. Social movements consist of organized efforts to create social change or create cultural change. And again, when we get to the end of the semester, the last couple weeks of the semester are going to be spent kind of unpacking and looking at these four processes and trying to make sense of their impact. So we're going to go into a lot more detail, but I wanted to make sure that I introduced everybody to these concepts now, so that as we talk about structure and we talk about processes over the next couple weeks, you guys won't feel like you don't have a grasp of that or a basic understanding. And so again, just to reiterate, here's our model again, and with all the parts in place. And when you look at this, you can see in essence the map for sociology, right? Sociology considers all of this. Now, an individual sociologist might not look at this in kind of a big picture fashion. They may be focused on organizations, or they may be looking at deviance, or they might be very interested in understanding the dynamics that unfold in the context of a group, right? A small set of individuals, right? So individually, sociologists are going to find themselves located at a particular level of social organization. Maybe they're micro level sociologists, maybe they're macro level sociologists. Some of them are going to study organizations, others will study institutions. Some people study the global network of societies, what we call the world system. So, at every level, you're going to find something that's worth exploring and trying to understand from a sociological perspective, or through that lens. But it's, I think, important that you have a good overview of what sociologists are talking about when they talk about structure, because let's face it, we're going to talk about that a lot. All right, so we have one more unit before we wrap up this particular module. I'm going to talk about economic systems in modern society. Until then, you guys have a great day.